All right, good morning. So we're going to do notes number 2. Most of the notes number 2 are about long waves and the role of the international monetary system in those long waves. There's a question number 3 on the exam about long waves and the regulation theory, which is a way of explaining long waves. There's a question number 2 on the exam that I'm talking about. I talked a bit about yesterday, and I will talk a bit about today, and then I'll talk a bit about on Thursdays. That's about the euro currencies market. That's the kind of the engine of global finance. Right. So unfortunately, that particular question has bits and pieces all over the place. So you have to kind of put it together in a more coherent way. It's not as compact a question as the number 1 question, the number 3 question. All right. But before I get into long waves, I want to talk about asymmetries of the international monetary system. Asymmetries. There's more than one. So this is in plural. Asymmetries are structural imbalances. And the structural imbalances arise from the fact, primarily from the fact that you have a national currency of a superpower also serving as world money. First, the pound sterling in the 19th century, until 1914, and then the US dollar since 1945. So these currencies, these leading currencies, have a dual life. They exist both as national currency as well as international medium of exchange, and it's precisely in this dual role that there are contradictions, okay? And these contradictions create a system that's imbalanced. Asymmetries. Okay. And this became first, I mean, this was clear to like John Maynard Keynes already, in 1940, right? And he warned in the debate in Bretton Woods, he gave a very passionate speech about not having national currencies as world money, right? As part of the debate between him and Harry Dexter White, who was the US representative. And I mean, you have to remember, Keynes originally was a kind of a mathematician, probability theory and all that. And so he defined this problem as a numeraire problem, right? Where you have, in a closed system, if you think of the world economy as a closed system, you have n countries with n currencies. But if one of those currencies is world money, then you have only n minus 1 degrees, right? And so the nth currency is indeterminate. It doesn't have the same degree of freedom, right? Than the other currencies. It has to provide global liquidity, and that constrains it, right? So he framed it as a disadvantage for the country issuing the world money, which is interesting, right? In terms of degrees of freedom. But that's a very mathematical explanation, right? Kind of a network analysis type math, right? But it's still an interesting question in itself, in terms of game theory and whatever you want to play it out with in that direction. It's still an interesting problem, even from a mathematical point of view, right? So this is the numeraire problem, right? Keynes' numeraire problem. That's what we call it. Right? But now I want to talk to you about the Triffin dilemma, which is a much more historical, institutional, political, and policy framework for the asymmetry embedded in the dual role of the key currency serving as world money. Right? So this came to the world's attention in a very important and flashy moment in 1960. Right? So in 1960, you have, in the US, you have a very intense political moment between the Democrats and the Republicans, Nixon against Kennedy. The 50s were handled by the Republican majority, Eisenhower and Nixon. Kennedy was a very strange character, but comes from a very famous family. And Kennedy looked very kind of leftist in that framework. So in the 50s, the US was quite right-wing. And so people were very worried about if he wins, what would happen to inflation, what would happen to budget deficits, what would happen to the dollar. Okay. In 1960 also, something else is going on, which is that you suddenly go from a dollar, not so sudden, but it becomes conscious in a sudden way. The US goes from, the Bretton Woods system, which has been put in place in January 1st, 1945, has had dollar shortage, okay? And at the beginning, very intense dollar shortage, right? And then because of the way Bretton Woods works, and I will talk to you about that later, the US supplied liquidity in terms of dollar outflows to the rest of the world in a very organized way, right? Through military expenditures, through aid and assistance programs like the Marshall Plan, and also by turning its large corporations into multinational corporations, which being invited into other countries with foreign direct investment, right? So you have a system from 45 to 60 where the US runs very large trade surpluses. The US has had trade surpluses since 1873, continuously. So it runs what is called a current account surplus, right? And then it needs to export capital. It needs to run a capital account deficit that's larger than its current account surplus to have a balance of payments deficit. Okay, that's the key to Bretton Woods. Let me write this down, so that you understand this. Where's my? Oh, here. Okay, sorry. So that's the US, right? That's the rest of the world. The US needs to transfer dollars, yes? The rest of the world needs dollars to have reserves and to pay each other, right? So this is a net outflow, right, of dollars. The net outflow of dollars requires a balance of payments deficit, yes? The balance of payments account for all interactions between one country and the rest of the world. So it's a list of transactions. The transactions get grouped into different accounts: the current account, the capital account, and the official settlements account, or reserves account, right? There's 3 accounts. All the transactions are in one of those 3, right? So you have the current account, the capital account, and you have the official settlements account, or reserves account. Okay. Now forget about the reserves account in the case of the US. One of the asymmetries in a system where national money is also world money is that the issue of world money doesn't have to have any reserves. The US has less reserves than Luxembourg. And Luxembourg is like the size of Campinas. It's also a financial center of Europe, so it's not an innocent choice, right? But so the US keeps the current account, the capital account. The current account is basically trade. I mean, we will explain later that there's more to that. Trade is the dominant part of the current account, yes? And the US has a big plus here. Automatically, just by its dominant position in 1945 and onwards. And it became bigger because of World War II. The US is a net beneficiary of World War II. Other countries destroy each other, the US doesn't get destroyed. The US supplies the rest of the world with its products. Yes? So, in order to have a net outflow of dollars, you have to require balance of payments deficits. That means you have to have a capital account deficit that's larger than this. You have I'm making two minuses here and making two minuses here to explain that the capital account deficit in the US case has to be larger than its current account surplus. Otherwise, we don't have a net outflow. Do I make myself clear? Okay. Look, I was born into this system, right? My parents were refugees. I was born in a refugee camp in Austria, run by the American Army. The reason I'm actually here, not here, but in America, was that my uncle, who's like my father, I didn't have a good relationship with my father, but I had a great relationship with was a high-ranking American soldier who fell in love with the sister of my mother while I was pregnant. She was pregnant with me. Because he was in a Jeep and they were hitchhiking out of the camp, and the rest is history, right? But I grew up for 6 years in this camp with American soldiers, right? And then they were throwing dollars like that, right? So, later on, my father worked in Italy, in Vicenza. Vicenza is a beautiful city, great architecture, great architect called Palladio, fantastic city, but it's basically an American camp. Military camp, right? So wherever I go, there were soldiers, right? There were 3 million American soldiers, after the war. There was one way in which dollars were transferred from the US to Robbie Guttmann, right? But so we have the capital account with. This is part of the Cold War, right? Where the US tells the Germans don't have an army, tells the Japanese don't have an army. We take care of it. So they built a military network around encircling the Soviet Union. That's why you have this Vicenza military camp, right? But also, as I said, Marshall Plan, right? And the investments of multinational corporations, becoming multinational corporations. General Motors becomes a multinational corporation. It was not a multinational corporation before World War II. But it buys Opel, it buys Vauxhall, it buys various companies and then puts plants in there. And so you have these very organized capital outflows, yes? Do you understand? And this goes on for 15 years, and when we get to let's say it goes on for 13 years, till 1958. And by 1958, the dollar shortage is over, which also means that the various European currencies become convertible. During the period of dollar shortage, European currencies were not fully convertible or barely convertible, depends which country. They were extremely powerful controls in terms of exchange. I remember my parents were constantly worrying about that when I was a kid, because they had business there, business here, and they had all kinds of ways of moving money around, right? Which was always, sorry? Huh?
Come to the simple part.
Yeah, sorry, yes. Sorry, good, yes. Whew.
Sorry.
No, that's okay, right? It's just like, I don't see as well.
Yeah.
Right. It's okay. So, so 1958 is actually the official end of the dollar shortage. It's also when the currencies become convertible, that's when they can form the European Union, right? So the Treaty of Rome in 57 already envisaged this. In 58, they're able to make an economic community because they have convertible currencies, right? But by 1960, 2 years later, and that gets me to the Triffitt dilemma, there was such an outflow of dollars in 58, 59, 60, right? So that you're beginning to worry now about a dollar surplus, excess dollars. Okay? Yes? And the reason why you worry about excess dollars in the international circulation is because the dollar is supposed to be at the heart of Bretton Woods, is an anchor, a price anchor between the dollar and gold. Remember, we've had hundreds of years of gold standards, yes? And so the world is obsessed with gold. You can't just get out of gold like that. So in order to start, to have a gold exchange standard that's elastic, meaning where you supply money whenever somebody wants money, which is the opposite of the gold standard, yes? You still have to give people the confidence that that money that's elastic now is as good as gold. There's a contradiction, you understand? There's a contradiction right away. Because if you have gold, which is kind of a fixed supply, more or less, and you have substitutes that are supposed to be convertible with gold, like the dollar was on the Bretton Woods, then the whole idea is to have a scarce, right? To be tied to gold, which is basically scarce. It's a precious metal because it's scarce. At the same time, you want to have an elastic system that provides the world with liquidity, with money whenever they need it. That's the contradiction. That's the asymmetry we're talking about at the core. So the moment arises where suddenly in 1960 there's more dollars in international circulation. There's more dollars abroad outside of the US than the US has gold reserves. So de facto, the dollar becomes inconvertible against gold. If all the people outside of the US with dollars would come to the US and says, give me gold, the US would not be able to do it. Right? But the whole idea of Bretton Woods was that it was founded on a promise that the US would on demand automatically convert all the international dollars that would want to be converted into gold in gold. At a fixed price, $35 an ounce. And that fixed price between gold and dollars, $35 an ounce, was the core of the entire system or regime of fixed exchange rates that was built on, as Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was a fixed exchange rate system. And the currencies, the fixed exchange, where the currencies were defining gold weights. Yes? So if you have, for example, if you have $35 per ounce of gold, okay, but you have 140 marks as an ounce of gold, then you have automatic exchange it with 4 marks and $1. And that's how the system was built. But now you have a problem. You have excess dollars. You have too many dollars to be converted automatically to make the US maintain its promise, right? And so the first economist that talked about it in a kind of a, hey, wait a minute, you gotta do something about it, was this guy, Robert Triffitt, who was Belgian, but like me, he went to America and then became an American in a way. So he was a Belgian-American economist. The Triffitt Institute today is still in the outskirts of Brussels. You should actually go there, it's an interesting place. And because the Triffitt dilemma lives on today, in many different configurations. There's kind of interesting place to discuss this. They have constantly people going there talking about the Triffin dilemma. Okay. But the dilemma is this. The dilemma is a contradiction in the system. The dilemma is exactly as I tried to imply, right? On the one hand, the US has to supply dollars to the rest of the world, to supply liquidity for the rest of the world. But in the process, it weakens the system. It creates a situation that is unsustainable. So he wrote a book called Gold and the Dollar Crisis. It gets published right during the election campaign when everybody's worrying about Kennedy. And he gets invited to Congress for a big hearing because they want to harm Kennedy, right? The Republicans invite him. He gives this very famous speech in Congress about the Triffin dilemma. And immediately he creates a crisis. He actually creates the crisis in the congressional hearing. And so that's but when he kind of reframes it after he realizes that he's created the crisis by making people aware of it, because it's all about expectations, it's all about behavior, it's all about attitude, right? It's all about credibility, it's all about confidence. If you say crisis, 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 it's like screaming fire, 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 everybody runs. You know, you don't even know where the fire is, right? You just run because everybody else runs. So then he kind of says, listen, as long as people accept dollars and don't exchange them for gold, it's okay. It's just that there's still this contradiction. And so he reframed the contradiction, right? To make it less panic-stricken. He said the contradiction is a contradiction between the domestic interests of the country that issues world money and the long-term interests of the international monetary system to be sustainable. That's the contradiction. The contradiction is a contradiction of the dual role of the dollar as world money and national currency. And as a national currency, you have domestic interests, right? But you also have a long-term interest in sustaining the system, international monetary system. And sometimes these two interests that the Federal Reserve has are incompatible with each other. Okay? And if you frame it as generally as that, as a contradiction between short-term domestic interests and long-term international commitments, then you can apply the Triffin dilemma to today or to 1982. I mean, you can see how this Triffin dilemma goes through history, right? And at the end, it's going to be there unless you have a different international monetary system, which is a supranational money, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes? Is it okay? So, a couple of things I want to just mention because they're important, because this was a very important moment, right? To prevent a crisis, right? One is that the Fed in 1961 shows that it can manage this contradiction through something known as Operation Twist. Which is an ingenious thing that the Fed did again as one of its post-2008 crisis periods, right? It did again Operation Twist. Operation Twist, the idea is to raise short-term rates and lower long-term interest rates at the same time. what we in financial economics call flatten the yield curve. Okay? The yield curve is the relationship between short-term interest rates and long-term interest rates. Typically, it has a positive slope because long-term interest rates are typically higher, not always. By the way, when they're lower than the short-term interest rates, this is an indication of a recession to happen. So right now, for example, in Wall Street, everybody's watching the yield curve, okay? Because they know that if it goes down to a negative slope, there's going to be tensions in the financial system. Right? But anyway, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact that with Operation Twist, you're trying to simultaneously raise short-term rates and lower long-term rates. The way you do this, right, is that the Fed sells treasury bills that are short-term, lowers the price of the treasury bills, means higher interest rate. And then the money that it gets from selling the treasury bills, it then uses to buy treasury bonds, 10-year bonds or 5-year bonds, long-term bonds. And when it buys the bonds, it pushes the price up, and that means lower interest rates because there's an inverse relationship between the price of the bond and the interest rate of the bond. Okay, that you need to understand. Or you don't understand it, then that's not my problem. But in financial economics, one of the most important laws is the inverse relationship between the price of a security and its yield. And you can explain it mathematically, you can explain it structurally, you can explain it how the market adjusts, etc. There's many ways you can explain this inverse relationship. Okay? And the Fed does that, okay, out of the blue, because it wants to lower long-term interest rates to fight the impending recession. Lower long-term interest rates, people buy homes. Lower long-term interest rates, businesses invest. But you want to slow down the outflows in the Bretton Woods system. You have to raise short-term interest rates so that more money stays in the US and more money comes into the US. Right? So the Fed does both at the same time. And it succeeds. And then, wow, hey, Triffin dilemma resolved. Great. A year later, the US then is in a stronger position. It goes to the other countries, trying to convince the other countries not to use the excess dollars to sink the Bretton Woods system. Okay, it has an agreement with 9 other countries. It's called the General Agreement of Borrowing, GAB, so also known as G10.
The same as the Golden Rule?
Huh?
The same as the Golden Rule?
Yes, it's the beginning of that. Yes. So they have an agreement to sustain the Bretton Woods system, and they organize it, orchestrate it through an organization that was completely forgotten about, that then becomes more important, the Bank for International Settlements. Okay? Yes. Do you know anything about this? I'm sure that you do. But the others, do you know anything about the BIS?
After the Second World War?
Well, the BIS is more important today than it ever was, right? But what do you know about it?
Those institutions which were created.
No, this was created in 1930 to prevent the Germans from defaulting. But then it failed, and then nobody wanted to do anything with it, okay? So it was sort of forgotten about, right? But it gets revived in this agreement, okay? They coordinate the agreement, they carry out the agreement through the BIS. The BIS then becomes the central bank of central banks, okay? You understand that? It is the central bank of central banks. It's the umbrella organization of the 13 largest central banks, not the Chinese central bank in it, okay? So I shouldn't say the third largest, but it is the Western central banks. Okay, they coordinate. Tell me what else it does today. You should know that.
They are responsible for the Basel Committee.
Yes.
Regulation.
So they are responsible for the global banking regulations of the euro currencies market. Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, and next year Basel IV. And it's called Basel. Do you know why it's called Basel? Because the BIS is in Basel. It's a Swiss city. It's probably the ugliest Swiss city that I've ever been to. Okay? Swiss cities are very beautiful. Not Basel. I mean, Roger Federer, is from there. It has one skyscraper, that's the BIS. Okay? Otherwise, it's just pharmaceutical companies and chemical plants. It's an industrial city on the border of Germany and Switzerland. All right. Now that I've introduced the BIS to you, if you want to know anything about finance, if you want to know anything about cryptocurrencies, if you want to know more about digital currencies and all that, you go to bis.org. You go there, you get lost for a year. Okay. I'm not kidding. It's an incredible website. Incredible website. I mean, there's so much information about global finance in there that it kind of explodes you. And it's well done. They write well. They're very smart people from all over the world. It's a beautiful place to think about finance. But it's also the global regulator now, right? I will give you the different steps in the course of this course, right? So the other thing that happens in 1960 is precisely this euro currency market. Most of the no. I don't. I just have to remember. So in 1960, the idea also is to have a new international payment system and to allow it. And the US accepts it, basically, right? This euro currencies market, right? So the US accepts that it's no longer just between central banks that the dollars flow, right? The US accepts that dollars can flow between private banks. In other words, you can have dollar deposits abroad, outside of the US. That's what we mean by euro currencies market. So initially it was called the euro dollar market, right? It has nothing to do with the euro, okay? It's only called euro dollars because it starts in London. London still is technically in Europe, right? Even though the people around London don't not necessarily know that. The people in London know it very well, precisely because they're a financial center of Europe, which they're about to not be. Right? London is in a very dramatic moment. So all these excess dollars have a way to go. They can go to accumulation of reserves of countries, but more importantly, they can go into the private banking system and then circulate in a new payment system. And the new payment system is the euro currencies. And they have in the system, you have two computer networks, CHIPS and SWIFT. CHIPS is basically the electronic fund transfers, okay, where banks transfer funds. Each country has its own national electronic fund transfer network that is run by the central bank, okay? And this way you can have PIX, in Brazil. But between countries, it's not so straightforward. So you have a private banking consortium that's called CHIPS. Clearinghouse International Payment System. So banks can send each other money, right? And then they have a communication system where they give instructions and the verification of the fund transfers. That's called SWIFT. Every bank has a SWIFT address. Okay? It connects all the banks in the world. Pretty much. Okay? You can be in a small village in Papua New Guinea, and there's one little bank there, and it's connected to a bigger bank in Fort Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, which then is connected to an Indonesian bank, which then is connected to a Malaysian bank, connected to Singapore, and the Singapore banks deal with all those banks. This is known as the correspondence system. Yes, it connects all the banks in the world to each other. Okay. And this is the nerve center of global finance, right? The system. Okay. But the system of chips and SWIFT is done by 450 banks. Changes all the time. It's not a fixed number, right? Some banks come in, some banks go out. But this is known as the interbank system, right? With the interest rate between them is LIBOR, London Interbank Offer Rate, right? So half of the euro currency system is just between the largest banks, moving money around on behalf of the other bank clients, right? As the correspondence system. But this system gets built after 1960, and it makes finance global, stateless. Okay, you can have yen out, in Singapore. You can have dollars in Casablanca. It's everybody. I mean. And this also means that you have a global banking system, a financial system beyond the reach of any individual central bank. It's only later, after 1988, that the central banks get together again with the BIS and start coordinating regulation of it. That's Basel I. I'll talk to you about that later. So the dollar surplus does not create a crisis until much later. It creates a crisis in 1968, and they managed that crisis with the gold pool. This idea of the gold pool, Bruno, becomes crucial in 1968 because they split the price of gold, right? So they have an official price and an informal price in London, right? And there's always a controlled arbitrage between the two. Okay? That's how they saved the system for 3 more years, from 68 to 71. I'm talking here about the Bretton Woods system, okay? Which then collapses August 15, 1971. What Triffin predicted happens 11 years later, in 1971. Which to me I was 20 years old. I just turned 20, and it was an explosion. I have to tell you a story, okay? I mean, because you should know as young people how certain moments in your life become completely decisive without you knowing it. Only later do you know it, right? So I'm telling you a funny story. So in 1971, before the collapse, I was 20 years old. I was still 19. It was in the spring of 71. I take my first economics class. Right? I'm a second-year student. I wanted to study sociology and history, and I realized that's not going to work. I wanted to leave Vienna. I need to have a job. Let's have economics. And I have friends, and they push me, and we go to economics class, and we sit in this class, and there's this huge man, and he talks like that. His name is, I have to tell you his name because he's a very interesting guy. Erich Streixler. He's the leading advocate of what is called the Austrian School of Economics. So he's a disciple of Hayek. He's a conservative guy. He was the chief brain strategist of the Conservative Party in Austria. He's a famous economist. We go to his class because he's a famous economist. I have no idea. But my friends go, my friends who become also economics professor later, let's go. He's a crazy guy, everybody talks about him. And he's a crazy guy. And he's a huge man with this incredibly high voice. But he's a quite brilliant guy, and he loves to heckle students, So I'm in this class. It's maybe 3 or 4 weeks in the class. He comes into this class and he looks at me. He says, "You over there." At that point, I have a long beard, long hair, and I look around and say, "No, no, 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 you." I said, "Yes. What's your name?" I said, "Guttmann." He said, "Are you really a good man?" "I don't think so." I said, "Why?" He said, "I saw you yesterday. The day before, I was in a demonstration against the Vietnam War. And I was screaming like all the others, 'We don't want to pay for Vietnam,' among other things, right?" And he said, "I was watching you and you were screaming, 'We don't want to pay for Vietnam.' Why did you say that?" And I said, "Well, everybody else was screaming, but that's not an explanation. Why were you all screaming, 'I don't want to pay for Vietnam'? You're Viennese, you're Austrian. What do you have to do with Vietnam?" And I fall apart. I get very embarrassed. I turn sweaty and red. That was almost like yesterday. I remember it. And I just can't say something. And I can't. And he said, "I like these leftist schmucks." Schmucks is like assholes, right? They don't know what they're talking about. And then he comes to me and looks like that and says, "The funny thing is that you were completely right. You know why? You don't know why, but you should know why. You should always know why you're saying what you're saying. Write me a paper." And I'm kaput, and I cannot concentrate, and I don't know what to do, because I know this is a big guy, right? If I piss him off, if I make him angry, if I disappoint him, I have a very hard time being a student in Vienna, in this institute that he runs. So after the class ends, he sits there, and I go to him and says, "Can you help me?" There's no internet. There's nothing there, right? Just dusty library that's 200 years old, University of Vienna. And he said, "2 words, Bretton Woods. Till Thursday, 10 pages. Every week. I go out, my friends are there. He said, Bretton Woods. And one of the economists, one of my friends who became later the youngest professor at Cambridge University in economics, called Michael Landesmann, he said, "I've heard about this, let's go to the library." And the 3 of us look, I write a paper, he loves it. And later on, he calls American universities to say, "Take this Robert Guttmann," And so I have a choice between Wisconsin and Columbia, I go to Wisconsin. That's the rest of them. So that's how I first sort of managed to get out of there. But from then on, Bretton Woods is in my head, okay? And lo and behold, 5 months later, the Bretton Woods system collapses. My first publication is about how we Europeans paid for the Vietnam War, published in a German book by Elmar Altvater, who's a famous Marxist economist, right? Who wrote a great book about Bretton Woods, right? With whom I then worked at the Free University of Berlin when I was trying to write my doctorate there. But it failed, so I had to go back to London. Anyway, it's a long story. But understand that this little moment completely shaped my life, right? Out of the blue, And so I'm obsessed with Bretton Woods, yes. That's part of my story, right? So let's go back to Bretton Woods. The reason why we paid for the Vietnam War is precisely the problem of seigniorage. Okay, so I'm done with the Triffin dilemma. Do you have any? You can ask me questions about it later, right? So just to give you a little idea about the Triffin dilemma today, right? So right now the Fed is raising interest rates really fast and hard. Are you aware of that? And it creates an incredible amount of pressure on other countries. To the point where the Brazilian central bank has to raise interest rates even before the Fed, so as not to sink the real to a point where it becomes hyperinflation. That's the Triffin dilemma today. It's a reverse of Manchenko's currency wars, right? Which I will talk to you about later. So the Triffin dilemma is built into the system, and it has different configurations over different periods of time. So, but one of the asymmetries that is crucial, which is actually different from how Keynes conceived of it in the numeraire problem discussion, is the advantages that the issue of world money gets from being the issue of world money. Okay. So, this is a notion called seigniorage, which my American students always misspell. Seigniorage. So seigniorage is a medieval concept, okay? And for a while it had to do with the face value of a coin and the actual value of the coin, right? So countries were debasing their currencies. So a $100 coin actually had only gold up to $50 or something like that. And so this has been going on since Nero, since 2000 years, right? But then in the more modern iteration, so in the Bretton Woods system, for example, seigniorage has to do with the fact that the issue of world money gets a profit from issuing dollars into international circulation. Because when you look at it concretely, I mean, now I wiped it out, it's stupid, but when you go back to this flow here, right, from the US to the rest of the world, there's actually, let's do this again. Right? Dollar outflow. There's also a dollar reflux, right? Because, for example, when the rest of the world keeps reserves in dollars, they don't keep them under their mattress or in the safe in the central bank. They invest them in US treasuries. Okay? So there's this flow. But the flow this is much more profitable, okay, than this. The US invests buying companies, building plants. So when you look at the country's balance of payments, not just in terms of flows, but also in stocks and assets and liabilities, the seigniorage benefit for the US is that it has zero interest or very low interest liabilities, and it has high yielding assets, foreign assets. Okay? These are its investments, they're high yielding assets. And then the reflux is in treasuries, which are, or cash reserves, which are very low yielding or zero yielding. And that difference is a profit that you can actually measure. So the IMF has all the different, measures of seigniorage. It's like sometimes it's 30 billion, sometimes 60 billion. It's not a big deal. Okay. But this is a very narrow concept, yielding a very small profit. Okay? So then, Barry Eichengreen, who is a famous American economist from UC Berkeley, he kind of expanded that concept with this notion of exorbitant privilege. That was not his notion, but he called privilege, sorry. 2 I's, 2 E's. So this was coined in 1965 by the then French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, right, when he was complaining about the dollar. Precisely in this context of we're paying for everything, we Europeans, right? Because, this going back to the Erich Streisler story, right? when the US started to have a war and not pay for the war with taxes in the late 60s, because the war was so unpopular that Johnson could not raise taxes to finance the war, the US ran very large budget deficits, which then became increasingly large balance of payments deficits. The two were completely linked. And so the much of the balance of payments deficits of the US that were related to the Vietnam War were observed by the Europeans. You know? And so they basically helped finance the Vietnam War. That was the whole idea where Schweizer said, you know, you're right. You know, and I kind of got there to that point in this 10-page paper. I discussed it with Miki Landesmann and Peter Rosner, my friends, who, you know, were better economists than I was, and we figured it out, right? But by that, we read this book by Elmar Altvater, who explained that, right? Who then became our god, the most important Marxist economist in Germany. Right? You should also have that name. I saw him actually not so long ago in Barão Geraldo Hotel. It was in Unicamp.
He's close to some
He just
German
died.
colleagues that
Yeah, right. He died
right.
recently. Yes, I managed to go and say goodbye to him. Right. This is a very important guy, and he wrote some of the stuff also in English. Right? So. So the exorbitant privilege definition by Barry Eichengreen has to do with the net investment income. Sorry, this is net investment income balance. Which is part of the current account. And it relates to seigniorage, okay? It's just a more elaborate explanation. The mystery which Eichengreen addresses is that the US has a pretty much, when it comes to its net income investment balance, which is foreign income that gets repatriated, earned by its foreign assets, versus foreign liabilities and foreigners bring the money back out, right, out of the US. That is in balance. It's usually zero or small deficit, small surplus, but it's basically in balance. And has been in balance for a long time. It doesn't change much. It might change now, okay? Which is an interesting moment, just as a question, because right now it's going down. But this is mysterious because the US has an increasingly large deficit on its assets and minus liabilities, right? It owes the rest of the world, as I already told you yesterday, right? Since 1985, the US has had continuously fewer investments abroad than the foreigners have invested in the US. Except the foreigners invest mostly in treasuries, and the US invests in productive assets or financial assets, right? That's what I already explained to you with seigniorage before, right? But when you look at this, not as stocks, but as a flow, as Eichengreen does, and you look at the income flows, you realize that the US earns a lot more on its foreign investments than the foreigners earn on their foreign investments in the US, and therefore there's this balance. And that's an incredible privilege because it allows the US to basically carry this negative position indefinitely. The negative position in terms of its foreign debts, accumulating foreign debts. Right? So this is a privilege. And it's an exorbitant, that means extreme, you know. But my third way of understanding this is my own obsession, because that comes back from the Vietnam War and all this Erich Streisler trauma that I have, is that the US can basically borrow money from the rest of the world in its own currency. Okay? And therefore, it doesn't have foreign debts. It doesn't have to settle foreign debts. It never settles foreign debts. Okay? It just, whenever the debts come due, it replaces the old debt with a new debt, right? There was only 2 or 3 years in the last 30, 40 years where the US actually paid down some of its debts. And that was under Clinton. So the US has, you know, accumulated from 1985 to now debts on the order of $8.5 trillion foreign debts, without anybody even knowing about it in America. Even in Congress, the Americans, the leaders, the political leaders in the US are not aware that the US is a net debtor, right? They get taught by the central bank that, you know. I mean, Biden knew, but Trump had no idea, right? Obama didn't know, but then he was explained to this, right? The US is a net debtor without feeling it, because it's not a net debtor like Brazil. Brazil is a net debtor in dollars, or maybe a bit also in euros, right? And you know it because you have to work to service that debt. The US doesn't have to do anything. It just does, here are new treasuries, please take them. Yeah. And this means that the US doesn't have any external constraint. It means that the US can basically do whatever it wants in terms of debts, deficits, right? It is not constrained. It's only constrained by inflation. I don't know whether you're aware of modern money theory. The modern money theory people take that to say that the US can spend whatever it wants, whatever deficit, right? And there's inflation, then there's tax. This only, I mean, I don't personally, by the way, I don't believe in it, because when I look precisely at how they argue this in terms of the accounting, it doesn't work already there. Right? They confuse two different accounts that are linked, but they're not the same. Okay, but that's, I mentioned this once to Randall Ray, who also comes to Unicamp all the time, and he just almost killed me. He got so angry, you know. And then I said, he said, show it to me. I said, let me show it to you. I was trying to draw it, and he took the paper, just threw it out and left. I don't want to belittle Randy Ray because he's also a friend of ours, but he can get very angry, okay? The one that's more reasonable is Stephanie Kell, who is a very, very smart person and very calm compared to Randy Ray. She's the advisor of Bernie Sanders, if you want to know. But you know, the left in the US is into that, right? Because it's to some degree it's almost true, but not in their explanation. It's true in the explanation of this, my interpretation of the seigniorage. The US has a degree of freedom that other countries don't have in terms of doing what it wants to do, running deficits, both budget and balance of payments. As long as the rest of the world accepts dollars. Right? So I think you wrote a paper about MMT in periphery. It doesn't work in the periphery. It doesn't work in the periphery. There's degrees, there's graduations, okay, of the degrees of freedom. This pyramid that we were talking about yesterday is also a pyramid of the degrees of freedom that countries have. That's a very important thing to think about. Okay. All right. So because the US can do whatever it wants, that's a degree of policy mixed freedom that nobody else has. I don't know how this is going to work in the multi-currency system, by the way. I do not know this. This is one of the questions that I'm thinking about. Okay, do you have more degrees of freedom when you have more poles, or do they have less? Does it depend on their coordination, or can they have adversarial relationships? Those are key questions. Okay? If you want to work on that, that's not a bad question. I know that the top European economists are, that are working for the European Central Bank, like Lorenzo Bini Smaghi, Padua Scioppa, and all those people are thinking about exactly that. Okay? What does it mean for the European Union to have a euro internationalized? Does it get the same advantage that the US had? And at one moment soon, this will become a key point in the arguments about in Europe. Right? But I'm not, let's go on. The other thing is that there's another advantage that is kind of complicated. Part of this is that the dollar is overvalued because it has this international liquidity preference that it represents, and so there's a lot of demand for dollars. And so the dollar is relatively overvalued. That means for the Americans, it's not a big problem because they have a fairly small tradable sector that has to be very competitive, okay? So that's the challenge for the tradable sector, but the rest of the economy it's a pretty closed economy, right? Compared to most other countries. Right? It's a huge economy, basically. That's the reason why it has a lot of resources, so it has a lot of comparative advantages at home, right? So the fact that it has an overvalued dollar doesn't really impact it that much, except that it gets cheap imports, and that's an advantage. And it can buy assets abroad very cheaply. And it can get Americans to travel, which they do in a very weird way. That's also an advantage, right? Having an overvalued dollar in a relatively closed economy. So that's my discussion, right? Now I want to talk to you about the second half of this class, right? Of notes number 2, which is long waves. I mean, if you have a question now, before I go, we can talk about it, but I'd rather have you ask the questions after the break, right? Like we did yesterday. Because I don't want to get too distracted to get through those 2 hours, right? And long waves is a long discussion too. Right? So I try to compress it because I spend a lot of time on Erich Streisel stories and all that. So have you ever heard of long waves? This is not a mainstream thing in economics, okay? This is not even a mainstream thing in heterodox economics. Okay, this is a relatively small idea in terms of how many economists know about it, think about it, accept it, etc. Okay, but to me, it's central. In my own way of thinking, it's completely central. And again, it's a story that came to me a year later. A year later, I had a beautiful moment where a very famous kind of a rock star came to the University of Vienna for a week to talk about his work. And he was like a rock star, but he was an economist, he was a politician, he was the head of the Fourth International, his name was Ernest Mandel. Sorry. Ernest Mandel. When in 1968, 9, 70, 71, we were all Marxists, It was kind of a strange thing, right? And Mandel was considered to be, in the German-speaking world, the greatest Marxist economist. And he kind of travels around to different places, right? And it's like a rock concert. I mean, it's kind of very strange, right? There was in the largest aula of Vienna, there were like 800 people, right? Rocking, making noise, And then he kind of got tired of it, and he kind of made a small meeting, and then, it was more intimate and this and that. But yeah, he was there for 4 or 5 days. And he was working on long waves. He wrote a book later called Long Waves, right? Which is an incredible book, actually, which I'll talk about in a minute. So then I got into long waves, right? Because I was listening to this guy. And so I was starting to think about it a lot. And I was thinking about it and beginning to work on it and writing about it. And then 9 years later, November 4th, 1980, I present my work in France for the first time because I met this Marxist economist called Suzanne de Brunhoff, and she looked at my work. She was my first wife was an economist at Columbia. She took a break, and Suzanne de Brunhoff was teaching her course, and at help time came to our house all the time to figure out how to deal with these crazy American students. And so then eventually she started looking at me, and I showed her my work because I was into money, and I knew that I had read her book Marx on Money, and blah, blah, blah. And then said, you do exactly the same work as these guys over there at Sepremap. Let me call Sepremap. So Sepremap was an research institute in Paris, the old planning ministry. And I go there, I had no clue who these people were, and I present my work, and they kind of adopt me, right? They basically say, oh yeah, let's come be part of us. So then from then on, 1980, this was the day that Reagan got elected, right? From then on, I work in Paris every year until 2019. This guy, Bruno, was there, right? Took my classes, right? Fernando's not here today also, right? So there's this Paris part of me. But the Paris part is la théorie de la régulation. Regulation. But regulation was not the same as the English word of regulation. I'll explain that in a minute. But let's talk about long waves systematically, okay? So there's the inventor of the idea of long waves is a guy called Nikolai Kondratiev. So these are also known as the Kondratiev waves or K waves. Okay, Kondratiev was a young Soviet economist, already very famous as a student. He published papers already as a student. He was the student of a very famous economist, a very famous sociologist, Tugal Baranovsky. And in Leningrad, then St. Petersburg. And so he was already kind of a precocious person who had a lot of ideas. And then, because he was agriculture economics, Lenin saw him, and there was this crisis, of course, with agriculture. So he designed a whole land supply system and land reform and all that. He was like 21 or 22 when he was doing that, okay? And then Lenin rewards him by making him the head of an institute that gets well-funded, the Institute for Conjuncture, for the study of cycles, right? 1922. And Kondratiev gets 50, 60 people to work with, right? And they study cycles, right? A lot of this has to do with a debate that starts in 21 about what is called the New Economic Policy Program, NEP. After the Civil War, after the revolution of the Civil War, the economy is completely destroyed. They're trying to figure out how to rebuild it. And they have a sort of an idea of a transition to a higher stage and all that. And so they're trying to figure out how to kind of have a mixed economy. This is Bukharin, this is a whole bunch of economists, right? And Lenin is very much in favor of that, and he puts Kondratiev in the key point, right? So between 22 and 28, Kondratiev runs this institute that studies cycles, and what he ends up doing There's a lot of very interesting econometric work and a lot of interesting statistical work about trends and cycles. I mean, they have a whole debate among themselves about cycles and how to measure cycles, which is in itself really interesting, okay? And Trotsky comes in there and is part of the debate and all that, right? But what Kondratiev ends up doing is he studies the long movements of prices and output, right? In Germany, England, France, and the US over a 150-year period. And he sees these cycles, these long waves, 40, 60-year cycles. And then he's trying to figure out what drives those cycles. First, he starts with agriculture because in agricultural economics, and the agriculture is still very important. But then he starts other commodities. He doesn't have a lot of output measures, okay? That's one of his big weaknesses, right? Because it's just difficult at that point to get output measures. And he knows it. In 1924, he's invited to travel to Germany, England, and the US. He meets Keynes, he meets Mitchell in the US. And so he's already an international star. People know about him, you know. So that's important because the moment he publishes, he gets published in German, English. So we have his work. Stalin hates him. And the whole idea that capitalism can have long waves is completely anti-Marxist in the idea of Stalin. How capitalism is supposed to break down. It doesn't. Long waves show that the system can reform itself, can rebalance itself. So this is already politically a real problematic thing, right? And he pays a price. The institute gets shut down in 28. He has a trial in 31 as a traitor. And in the Great Purge of 37, 38, he gets executed. He dies at 40 something, right? He's 46 years old at that point. He writes in prison. And they just published his work in the 1990s, okay, which I have not read. Okay? I'm going to try and get that. So we have only this 6-year period, right? With 4 or 5 articles in Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economics and Statistics, and then the best articles in German, right? In the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung. But you know, it's only 4 or 5 articles. Okay? That's it. So a year after he gets executed, Josef Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, discovers this work, studies it, writes about it, in a fantastic book that you have to read before you die, called Business Cycles. A crazy book, Josef Schumpeter, 1939. He just had come to Harvard, right? He writes this book, Business Cycles. And he has a long chapter on Kondratiev. Right? And so it's Schumpeter that discovers Kondratiev, makes him, you know, a household name in a way among those who are interested in cycles, right? And Schumpeter tries to explain this, right? Through technological cycles, right? A technological cycle. I'll get to that in a minute. I want to go back to Ernest Mandel, right? So I'm going to give you a Marxist explanation for long waves, the Schumpeterian explanation of long waves, the Minskian explanation of long waves, and then the regulationist explanation of long waves, right? And I'm going to do this in 40 minutes. But I sent you the book that I just published, and it's chapter 2 in my book. Okay? It's my favorite chapter myself, personally, right? But it's also question number 3 on your exam, right? So, Marx in volume 3, chapter 13, has this the long-term tendency of the profit rate to fall, right? This is a long history, right? All the classical political economists from Smith onwards, through Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, all the way to Marx, have this idea of a profit rate of decline over the long run, right? Which they call sometimes stationary state, steady state, etc. Right? Marx has a very different explanation than the others. And the Marxist explanation has to do with the increasing capital intensity of technology, right? What he calls the rising organic composition of capital. So what he's talking about is basically through competition you get automation. Competition between firms motivates automation. So you have increasingly automated production methods using fewer workers relative to machinery. So far so good? The problem is that in Marxist thinking, you extract surplus value, the source of profit, from living labor, not machines. Machines just transfer value. Humans create value. So when you have increasing organic composition of capital, that means increasing automation, more and more mechanized production, more and more machinery per worker, you basically getting a lower profit rate, right? Because the capital, the profit rate, right? The capital is in the denominator, and the profit source is living labor in the numerator, right? If you have less and less living labor, less and less numerator compared to a bigger denominator, you get a falling ratio. You following me? But the next chapter, because Marx said this is a problem for capitalism. Eventually the profit rate is going to be too low. You're going to get crisis. So Marx has about 4 different explanations for crisis in capitalism, right? This is a key one that he goes back to, right? Okay. Then he has a kind of overproduction, underconsumption, the dual nature of the wage explanation. That's a different explanation, okay? But this one that is clearly in the tradition of classical political economy and clearly his most well worked out methodical kind of explanation is in this chapter on the falling profit rate. But then he has the next chapter following this, which he calls countervailing forces. All the forces that you can mobilize as a capitalist or as a capitalist system to prevent or to counteract this tendency, to restore profitability. Okay? So he has, of course, more exploitation, lower the wages, right? Create a mass unemployment so you can push the wage down, have them work longer hours, cheap and constant capital, trade, more efficient circulation of capital. He has like 5 or 6 different countervailing forces, right? And Mandel takes these 2 chapters and basically argues that the countervailing forces, 4 out of the 5, except trade, are best organized in a crisis. So, and this is already in Marx. Marx already has understanding that the crises are a way of rebalancing the system. But this becomes much more explicit in Mandel's work. This already becomes explicit in Mandel's first great work called Marxist Economic Analysis. But then it becomes clearly the center of his theory when he talks about long waves in the third book that he writes. So one way to explain the long waves is that you have these periods of boom that then lead to crisis because of falling profit rates. The crisis then creates conditions where the profit rate can go up again. That's the Mandelian view. Okay. Then you get a second view, which is Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter. This is beginning already in business cycles, 1939, but this becomes a much more important theme in the Schumpeter's classic, which is called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, in 1943. And I mean, Schumpeter is important about the role of the entrepreneur. Schumpeter is important about innovation and what it means in capitalism. But Schumpeter is also, the key concept is a concept called creative destruction. Schumpeter creative destruction, which is in the 1943 book. And this has to do with new technology replacing old technology. So then Schumpeter builds a theory of tech cycles, basically, right? Where you have and the question is, it's often in crisis that there's increased technological innovation, but it's not yet matured. It's only when it matures as the engine of the upswing. And so he has this idea that one innovation begets other innovation. He has this idea of innovation clusters. Okay? And to him, long waves are when those innovation clusters have matured enough to take off. Okay? And so a long wave is driven by strategic new technologies becoming growth industries. Two things happen that make this cyclical. One is that those new industries, those new technologies make obsolete other technologies. That's creative destruction, right? So there's also accelerating obsolescence. When there's a strong growth period, when the growth industries are really young and they're rising rapidly, they overpower the destruction effect. The destruction effect is slower. And it's precisely when those new industries become mature and they slow down and the destruction is still cumulatively growing that you then get problems in terms of decline. Right? So there's a kind of an S-curve, in creative destruction, right? This is how I read what he writes, right? I mean, I know that other people have other opinions about this. There's still a bit of mystery how the creative destruction works in the cycle, right? But I think I can make an argument. I want to write a paper exactly about that because there's other explanations. It would be kind of a nice discussion to have because we're facing this very much now too, right? So that's Schumpeter. It's a technological driven cycle, long wave, with innovation clusters becoming growth industries and then exhausting themselves. Yes? Then you have a financial dimension, which is Hyman Minsky. Do you know anything about Hyman Minsky? Does anybody, do you know him?
Yes.
They should. They should, yes. So Minsky is famous for what is known the financial instability hypothesis. And this is something that he works out in the late 80s, early 90s. But much earlier already, he has this idea of financial stability over the long run. He has his second article that he published, right, in 1964, American Economic Review, is called Longer Waves in Financial Conditions, something with depression. I forgot the name. That's embarrassing. Sorry. Right. But it's a 1964 article, and it takes a long view of financial instability. And how shall I? Yes. So the key idea behind financial instability is that you take on more and more debt if things work out. You take on debt, you put it in production, it works, we take on more debt. Right? So especially when there's a euphoria and you're optimistic, you downplay risks, you take on more and more debts. And as you take on more debts, you gradually move into a more fragile position. Okay? So in this financial instability hypothesis, which you can apply for long waves, but you can also apply for shorter business cycles, you're moving from what he called a hedge position to a speculative position to a Ponzi position. Okay? Hedge position, speculative position. And the Ponzi position. In the hedge position, you are totally safe because you have a low enough level of debt that you have enough income to pay it off anytime. So you are hedged. That means you're protected. As you take on more debt, you move from the hedge position to the speculative position where your income is enough to service your debts. You can pay the interest on it and the repayment of it gradually, but you cannot pay off all the debt anymore. So it's a bit more risky, right? You can service the debt, but you cannot pay it off. When you get to a Ponzi position, then you're in trouble. That's the definition of what he calls financial fragility. Because in a Ponzi position, you don't have enough income to even service your debt. You have to take on new debt to service the old debt. So you get into a spiral. Okay? And his argument is basically that the incentive structure of capitalism is such that you're going to take on too much debt over a period of euphoria, over a boom period, over a period of stability when you don't think of crisis. This is in this 1964 article, the idea is stability breeds instability. It's like you're driving crazy, and then you get away with it, you're driving crazier until you crash, okay? Or you drink and you drink more and more, right? It's human behavior in a way, right? So the long waves in Minsky's framework are financial instability problems, right? So you build up in a long boom, you build up a lot of fragility, and then it explodes. And once it explodes, the long boom goes down into the downswing phase of the long wave, and you have to basically tighten your belts to pay off your debt or die. You have a choice. You either die, in the sense that you become insolvent and bankrupt, or you manage to pay off your debts, but in order to pay off your debts, you have to do the exact opposite of what you do in the boom. You have to have surpluses. You cannot spend much. And you have to pay off the debt rather than take on new debt. Right? So that's basically Minsky's argument. Okay. In the book, I have more subtle arguments about Minsky, right? In terms of the later work that he did about this, right? He did more work in the 1990s before he died about long waves and finance. But I don't have the time because I want to spend 25 minutes on what is, to me, the most interesting approach, which is regulation theory. Okay. So let's talk about that. So as I told you, I discovered those regulationists in 1980. When I went there to talk about long waves. They have a kind of a god, right, called Michel Alieta. He's quite an incredible guy. Whenever I listen to him, I'm like, he's an incredible engine of energy. He's, even now as an old man, he's still incredible. Okay, But he wrote this thesis, a doctoral thesis at Nanterre, where he also became a professor, about the US economy and the boom of the US economy in the 50s, 60s, and then the beginning of the crisis, right? It's called a theory of capitalist development. And this became the core of a school of thought, right? And then you have other people, the people in Seppelmap, Robert Boyer in particular, Alain Lippietz. So there's a more post-Keynesian version of the regulationist, that's Boyer. There's a more Marxist version that is ultimately Lippietz. And then there's others. There's just different thinkers. Okay. Also, where I used to be teaching at Paris 13, right, which now is called Université Sorbonne Paris Nord, and their institute, which is known as CEPN. So, but in a nutshell, they are an approach that puts all these different elements together, okay? And that's why I find them already more interesting, right? They don't just have a Schumpeterian dimension or a Minsky dimension, they put it together. And the way they put it together is by looking at a matrix of institutional arrangements. So they're ultimately institutionalists, okay? Their theory says that we have long waves. In order to have long waves, you have these long booms. It has to be arranged by a configuration of institutional compromises, if you will, that are made ultimately to work together. You make constantly adjustments so that they can kind of integrate. And they call this accumulation regime. So the key concept in regulation theory is regime d'accumulation, the accumulation regime. Accumulation regime is basically how a system, in this case the capitalist system, can reproduce itself going forward in expansion, right? Expanded reproduction going forward, right? And so they focus on 5 different areas, 5 different institutional pillars. So you have accumulation regime. So each long wave, this is my interpretation, right? I became a regulationist, and I became the most explicit regulationist about long waves. So, I mean, it's a complicated story because most of them were only interested in one accumulation regime and why it fell apart, right? Which is Fordism. But then, of course, some of them started working a little bit beyond that, and they were working on finance, and then finance later. So it would not be fair to say that all those regulationists are explicit long wave theoreticians. Okay, it's not. That wouldn't be fair to say. But and it's my class, so you know. And I have some debates, you know. I mean, there's debates, right? They think that I'm too deterministic, right? Which is a fair criticism. But this is typically also an argument against Marxists, right? You know, so, you know, well, there's also like a lot of prejudice there. I'm less deterministic in my own view than they think I am, like those who don't agree with me. Right? Complicated story. Don't worry about it. But you have the mode of regulation. And let's make a little accent aigu, which is the French word régulation. Because we want to distinguish this from the English word of regulation. The English word of regulation, basically, the way people understand it, is to have government constraints on business behavior. Okay.
The same in Portuguese for regulação.
Regulação is like the English word of regulation, right? But in the French understanding of this approach, it's the self-balancing capacity of the system. How the system balances itself. So it's the alternative to equilibrium. Okay? But the system can balance itself, but it balances itself very often through crisis. Okay? And it balances itself not only through crisis, but through innovation in institutions. Institutional arrangements get changed. Okay? Like, for example, go back to Ayeta. Okay? So Ayeta talks about Fordism, the post-war boom of the US as an accumulation regime. He called the Fordist regime of accumulation, Fordism. After the most car company, Henry Ford, Ford Motors, okay? And what Ford did, Henry Ford, who was not a nice guy, right? Nazi sympathizer and all that, right? But what he did, which was quite brilliant, is to realize that if you have these new assembly line, mass production technologies that he introduced, right? There's an incredible increase in productivity of the workers. But in order for that increased productivity, which yields to much larger output, to be absorbed in purchases, there has to be purchasing power, okay? There has to be the ability of the workers that are building these cars, so many of them so fast, to buy them. So the idea is to give them more money. If they have high productivity, to give them more money. You need a balance between wage growth and productivity gains. That's Fordism. Sorry.
It's being bread now, but not so.
No, I know. I can see that, yes. Right, so at the core of Fordism is an institutional regulation of wage gains and productivity growth. Go hand in hand. That's the micro foundation for a macroeconomic imbalance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this got crystallized in 1948 with an agreement between General Motors and the United Automobile Workers of America, the UAW, which is a very powerful union. They made an agreement where the workers would get paid every year more based on their productivity gains. If they have 2% productivity gains, they get 2% more. If they have 5% productivity gains, they get 5% more. Plus, of course, also compensation for inflation, cost of living adjustments. That was the second feature. That was a completely radical agreement, okay? That was a path-breaking agreement. That was an agreement that the entire industrial world adopted afterwards, not just in the US, but also in Europe. This was the correct institutional arrangement to create a boom. The post-war boom of the 50s and 60s. It's only when this balance between wage gains and productivity growth collapses in the late 60s that you get the inflation crisis, the end of the boom. Okay? But for 20 some years it worked. Okay? So this insight of Ayeta, who writes about this so you go from Taylorism, which is the Great Depression, to Fordism, matching aggregate supply capacity with aggregate demand capacity, right? Basically, right? But then, of course, you have to have elastic currency. So he talks about changes in the financial system, Glass-Steagall, how they regulated the financial system, but made for elastic supply of money through bank loans and so forth, right? So he puts together these institutional pillars. The mode of regulation is determined by the constellation of 5 institutional pillars. The wage-labor nexus, okay, types of competition, money, state intervention. For example, in Fordism, it's the welfare state and international dimension. These are the key institutional pillars that allow the system to reproduce itself over time. And each one of them is subject to institutional arrangements. And each of these institutional arrangements has to be complementary and coordinated with the other ones to have an accumulation regime that works. Okay? You can have a theory then of how these institutional arrangements exhaust themselves over time and also become more and more obsolete with other changes. Right? So one of the problems with regulation theory is that it's very good at figuring out why there's a boom. It's not so good at figuring out why there's a crisis after that. Okay? However, there is in the work, especially of Boyer, a kind of attempt at typology of crisis, which potentially is incredibly interesting work. I want to work on that more, right? Different types of crisis. And Lippietz has a bit of that. Mazier, who was the guy that I replaced in Paris right after he retired, he has very important work on that because he has 2 big books on crisis. So he, in a way, is the most important, Jacques Mazier. And Boyer, right? But there's much more work to be done in a way, okay? And so I'm going to try to do this in my next book, right? But the idea here is that you have lots of types of crisis, okay? But what you need for this long wave is you have to have great crisis. So Boyer has this concept of great crisis, but he always puts it in the quotation marks. Les grandes crises. It's only the great crisis that changed the accumulation regime. They're great because they changed the accumulation regime. And the idea is that you have lots of little cycles in a long boom, but then you have, at one point, you have a big crisis, which then pushes the long wave into its downswing phase. All right? And the way I see this is that there's different types of great crisis, okay? In that sense, I'm still very Marxist. You can have a crisis of the mode of regulation. That's already a big crisis, but the system can absorb it somehow, okay? I'll explain to you, I'll give you an example in a minute, okay? Then you can have a bigger crisis called the crisis of the accumulation regime, where you absolutely have to change the accumulation regime. And then the biggest crisis is the crisis of the mode of production. where basically the system collapses, right? That's like the crisis of the Soviet economy. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a crisis of the mode of production. Yeah. Literally, when you study the disintegration of the Soviet economy during Gorbachev's time, when he was trying desperately to reform, but it was no longer reformable because it was not just the crisis of that particular accumulation regime, it was the crisis of a mode of production. And in a way, ironically, the perestroika measures made this crisis worse. So I would argue, by the way, that the 2007-8 crisis was a crisis of the mode of regulation. But the crisis we're entering now is a crisis of the accumulation regime. That's my basic argument, okay? And so the crisis of the mode of production is a crisis where one of those pillars gets destroyed. It has impact on the other pillars, but the other pillars are capable of arranging themselves in such a way that the destruction of that one key pillar can be absorbed and can be repaired. Okay? And the repair may be done through a crisis. So when you have the stagflation crisis of the 1970s, which followed the destruction of that balance between wage growth and productivity gains, the system took measures to slow down the wage growth, right? And also to encourage more productivity gains, and eventually it rebalanced itself. Right? It's only when that system when the euro currency market destroyed financial regulations at home in this stagflation crisis, and that's another very important role of the euro currency market, that it made domestic banking regulations, financial regulations obsolete, because everybody could avoid these by going into the euro currency market and come back, especially interest rate ceiling in the US, regulation Q. Those ceilings became impossible to maintain when everybody could go into a market that had no ceilings. Not everybody, also, most Americans were not able to go there, some of them were, and companies were, and so it created already an incredible inequality right away that became politically destabilizing in the US. So they had to deregulate interest rates in 1979, 1980, 1982. The US deregulated interest rates in 3 steps. And that made it a crisis of the regime of accumulation, because then you get the dollar standard, then you get a different type of finance, then you get finance-led capitalism, you get a new system out of the deregulation of money and banking in 1979, 80, 82. So the initial crisis was a mode of regulation, that's the stagflation crisis, but the resolution of the stagflation crisis, 79 to 82, which is a deep recession, by the way, is a crisis of the regime of accumulation, and you come out of this with a different type of finance driving the system. I have a book that I can send, give it to you now, but I can give it to you, called Finance-Led Capitalism. That's the next accumulation regime after Fordism. And it is that long wave in 2007, 2008 that has the crisis of finance. But it gets absorbed because the world in 2009, in the Pittsburgh Agreement, the G20 agrees to re-regulate finance. This is Basel III, this is Dodd-Frank. We'll talk more about that, right? But it's the crisis of the regime of accumulation that is the second crisis. My argument is that the first crisis is a financial crisis at the beginning of the downswing of the long wave. But there's always a second crisis. And that's the transformative crisis. That's the crisis of the regime of accumulation. That's when the others say, you're too deterministic, Robbie, you're too deterministic. I am, but there's a logic to this, there's a logic. I can show it to you. I can show it to you historically. I can go through those long waves, right? You have, where do I do this? I'm almost done here. You have competitive accumulation regime from 1850 to 1914. Sorry, from 1850 to 1896. We have the monopolistic accumulation regime from 1896 to 1939. Then you have the Fordist accumulation regime from 1945 to 1982. Then you have finance-led capitalism accumulation regime, 1982 to 2000, who knows where, soon. And then you have, the next one is, let's call it eco-capitalism, dealing with climate change, the environment. Right? But when you look at this periodization of capitalist evolution, you see the long booms, you see the crises that turn the boom into a downswing phase, like the crisis of 1873, World War I, the breakdown of Bretton Woods stagflation crisis.
I wasn't able to.
But more importantly, you can also try to figure out how we get out of this downswing phase back into a boom. That is the big question, right? That's the big question. And that question is usually a mixture of crises and reform. Right?
Right.
Sorry, is there anything that I need to pay attention to? Okay. I'm almost done. No problem. Okay. So you don't get a new accumulation regime without substantial reforms. You don't get substantial reforms without a very deep crisis, forcing those reforms. Okay? That's the argument. One last point. Now going back to the international monetary system within that framework of la régulation. Okay? So the international monetary system is obviously a key part of this. But it also is a key part of this. And it embeds this. The types of state intervention have to do with the types of money and the types of international monetary system. Okay? As I mentioned to you before when I talked about modern money theory, is not the same in Brazil as in the US. Right? And it's not the same in Argentina as in Brazil. Right? That has to do with the international monetary system and your relative position in it. Right? In that pyramid, in that hierarchy. Another aspect that's crucial here is that the international monetary system plays a huge role in those long waves, both on the upswing and the downswing. This is crucial. In the upswing, it is a pro-growth vector. It's a pro-growth force. The international monetary system works to accelerate economic growth across a large space of the world. So it's also an inclusive system. It typically promotes globalization. It typically facilitates trade. It typically facilitates cross-border investments, both direct and portfolio. It typically, in the long wave, upswing, the dominant force is a centrifugal force from the center to the semi-periphery and the periphery in terms of money flows. In other words, the internet, Bretton Woods, for example, or the dollar standard in the 1990s, 2000s worked to allow other countries to catch up, to grow faster. There's a convergence process. A lot of this has to do with the fact that the world money issuer has an overvalued currency. That means the other currencies are undervalued, so they can facilitate export-led growth. This was true in the classic gold standard. This was true in Bretton Woods, as I explained to you, the US investing in military shields and aids and assistance and all that, right? That's a pro-growth regime that allows other countries to rebuild and then catch up. In the finance-led capitalism, the US was, now it's no longer banks, it's also funds, they invest abroad. So the other countries have access to international finance to a degree they didn't have before. The dollar is also overvalued. That means currencies, the other currencies are relatively undervalued. And the US runs these huge trade deficits now instead of trade surpluses. That's the difference between Bretton Woods and the dollar standard. The US is the buyer of the last resort for the rest of the world. So you have this iron embrace, right? The US runs large deficits, buying stuff, Brazilian coffee and soybeans and whatever, right? From many countries. Trade deficit goes all the way up to almost 8% of American GDP. That's huge, right? The other countries have export-led growth. They have surpluses, and then they give the surpluses back to the US, so the US can buy more. It's a recycling of that, okay? That's what drives finance-led capitalism. And the excess spending of the US is motivated by the way the finance works in the US in terms of asset bubbles. The US becomes a bubble economy. You have three bubbles. You have the corporate raiders, the stock market bubble of the 1980s. Then you have the dot-com bubble of the 1990s. And then you have the real estate bubble of the 2000s. Each of these bubbles creates wealth effects. The Americans don't have to save. They don't save. They have a negative savings rate at the end of this cycle, of this long wave. The US is the richest country in the world, has a minus 2% savings rate. That's because it has such huge capital gains from the bubbles. People feel rich. And the capital gains are not taxed or barely taxed. There's much lower capital gains taxes. This is a big issue in the US, right? This comes from Reaganomics. Reagan made capital gains taxes basically go away. This new tax package that the US is going to pass this week is repairing that, by the way. It's very important, very important. But let's go not there. Let's go back to finance-led capitalism, right? So the international monetary system in the upswing works for other countries. It works pro-globalization and it works to draw other countries into faster growth. But this leads to a financial crisis. And then it reverses. The international monetary system becomes the enemy of globalization. It becomes an engine of fragmentization, of deglobalization. It becomes a system of tensions, which is what exactly was from 2008 to now. On Thursday, I will explain to you what happened between 2008 and 2021, which I call the new deflation, and how that system turned itself into a system that became a burden, made things worse, both slow growth and tensions between countries. That's the same true in the stagflation crisis of the 70s and 80s. The same true in the interwar period, especially during the period of Great Depression, the second half of the interwar period. Right? You have clearly periods where you have a downswing phase and the international monetary system makes the downswing worse until you get to the next crisis, which is the transformative crisis. That's the pattern. That's the role of the international monetary system in that pattern. And that's where we are exactly now. That's why it's an interesting moment, if you want to look at it from that perspective, okay? All right, I'm done. Good.